Hey there, sports history fans. This is Darren Hayes of the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, here to tell you about a new way to play fantasy football this upcoming season. Tailgate Fantasy Sports is a game you've been waiting for. It's a new type of fantasy football that's totally free and easy to play. Just sign up with your email, pick your favorite NFL team, and set a 3-man lineup using only players from your team. Rotate 2 players each week and add power-ups to boost your player scores. Best part? 1 random power up drops every week. Now, don't replace your existing leagues. In fact, there might be the way to get some of your favorite players on your team, because we all know how hard it is to get your own hometown team's players in your home league. That is if you truly follow some semblance of ADP. I think we've all experienced that one before. Get all the rules for TailgateFantasySports.com, but the real action happens at TailgateFantasy.io. Tailgate Fantasy Sports, where the true fans rule the game. Join now and help us all put the word fan back into fantasy football. Background music courtesy Wikimedia Commons and the United States Air Force of the West Band.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. Thank you for joining us for the 4th in a series of 6 episodes in which we are naming the all-time starting 9's for various teams in Major League Baseball. We've done the National League East, we've done the National League Central, we've done the American League West, and today we are on to the American League Central, and I am Dan Newman, and I am joined as always by my co-host and brother, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm all right, Dan. Full disclosure, we just did the NL East episode. Tempers flared. There was some words exchanged. We had to take a bit of a cool down period. The lights were shut off. Were you sitting in the dark recovering? I came back into my little office area and the lights were off down in your room.
First of all, that's not true. And second of all, anybody who didn't listen to that episode first is going to go running to listen to that one and just get.
Oh, the lights were off.
Oh, did I turn the lights off?
The lights were off. Yeah.
Oh, I always turn the lights off when I leave rooms. It's one of my good habits. So,
I wonder where you got that from. Do you open the door to the basement 12 times a day, even though nobody's been down there all day, to see if the lights are off?
Less than 12, but yes, I do, because frankly, my wife is not good at turning off the basement light when she comes upstairs. So I do that with some frequency. Absolutely. So, all right. So AL Central today, we got 3 teams that kind of go back all the way to the founding of the American League and have been in that city under that branding, although the Cleveland, Indians recently became the Guardians, but, by and large have been that team for 120 years. We've got one team that does go back to the beginning of the American League in 1901, but then switched identities sort of halfway through and went from the Washington Senators to the Minnesota Twins. And then we got the Kansas City Royals, who didn't come in until 1969. So we've got 4 old teams, not super old because nobody goes back to the 19th century, and then one newer team to experiment with today. So I think they've all been fun, but I think this might be a fun little group to do today.
Yeah, and just, like we've talked about before, this is probably one of the easiest ones to trace the lineage. Like you mentioned, White Sox, Tigers, Indians / Guardians last couple of years are obviously the same teams they've always been. Kansas City Royals have only ever been the Kansas City Royals. And then the Twins, when we did the AL West and we talked about the Twins had a piece of the Senators, just the last iteration of the Senators, or the Rangers rather, excuse me. The Rangers had the 60s version of the Senators, basically. Well, the Twins have the historical Senators. So the Senators that existed from the beginning of the 20th century all the way up until 1960 when they moved to Minnesota. So it will be much more of a factor, although frankly not as much as it should be for a team that existed for that long.
Mm-hmm.
They will be a little bit more of a factor when that comes time. But the AL Central is another division that has a lot of classic teams to it. So we got a nice cross section of teams here, I think.
And what we do at the end is we rank them 1 to 5, and then we, obviously number 1 will then what we'll do is when we get to number to the last episode, we'll then rank the 6 division winners 1 to 6. So far, number 1 in the NL Central was the Cardinals. Number 1 in the AL West was unsurprisingly the Oakland Athletics, and then number 1 in the NL East was the Atlanta Braves. And that was a very spirited discussion at the end between actually 3 teams. I tried to make a little bit of a case for the Expos Nationals franchise, and so we'll see which team is going to join those 3 in our winners round, so to speak. I believe, Andrew, that you started us off last time, so maybe I'll start us off this time if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's all right with me. So you go ahead and pick.
All right, I'm going to pick the Detroit Tigers, and I'm going to go with the catcher Bill Freehan, first base Hank Greenberg, second base Charlie Gehringer, shortstop is Alan Trammell, third base is Miguel Cabrera. The outfield is going to be Al Kaline, Ty Cobb, and Wahoo Sam Crawford, a teammate of Cobb's in the early 20th century. And then my pitcher is going to be Hal Newhouser, who pitched for the Tigers in the 1940s and early 50s. We got 9 Hall of Famers there, or 8 Hall of Famers. I'm sorry, we don't, because Freehand's not a Hall of Famer. So you got 7 Hall of Famers and 1 who will be one day. And then you got Bill Freehan, but a very, very solid team, I would say. What are your thoughts?
So we're very, very similar. Freehan at catcher I had. Cochran, most of his better years were with Philly. Kirk Gibson, I feel like that would be more about name value in a moment, and that moment wasn't even when he was a Tiger.
Kirk Gibson, where? You don't mean the catcher, right? You just mean on the team?
Yeah. First base, Hank Greenberg. We're in agreement on everything. I wrote that Miguel Cabrera at third is a little bit cheating because he did not play a ton of third, I don't believe, as a Tiger. I'm going to pull this up. It's funny because we just recorded the Marlins episode where we talked about Miguel Cabrera, but I want to pull up his appearances as a third baseman with the Tigers, and he played, let's see.
He had some seasons.
His first, he played in 2012 and 2013. He was a full-time third baseman.
14 too.
No, he played 10 games at third base in 2014.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. So it was only 2 seasons. I'm looking at. So who did they bring in that year? Was that when they brought in Prince Fielder? I bet it was.
And so to be quick, the only one we had in pitcher, I had Newhouser as well. I thought Verlander would be a more of a lock, but as I looked, I realized that, Newhouser was a 2-time MVP. Now it does come with the caveat that it was 1944 and 1945, largely considered the 2 years of the lowest quality of baseball in the 20th century. Or maybe 43 and 44, because technically the war ended in 45, but, 2 very low eras, but still, you know what I mean? So I did have, the only place we differed was that I went with Harry Heilman as the third outfielder instead of Sam Crawford. And I have a feeling this is a discussion we can get into, but we're in agreement on everything else.
So I did also look at Verlander, and actually Verlander won an MVP also. It is really close. Let me find the comparison here. And it pitching can be tough to compare across eras. And I'm not a statistical expert. I'm much more of a, I like the stories part and sort of the moments part of sports history rather than the statistical analysis, but it is very close between the two here. Newhouser and Verlander. Newhouser 15 seasons. Verlander, I believe it's 13 years with the Tigers. Newhouser gets it in wins and ERA, slightly higher WAR, 61 versus 54. A lot of this can probably be attributed to the fact that, guys pitched a lot more often in those days. So yeah, it's close. It is really close between Newhouser and Verlander. I don't know. We've already done, as we discussed, the AL West. So maybe I was a little bit prejudiced by the fact that I wanted to see. We already had Verlander with the Astros, and maybe I just wanted to give somebody else a chance. It's also worth noting that even though Verlander had this amazing career in with Tigers, and his best season as a pro was 2011 when he won the Triple Crown in the American League for pitching, leading in strike, led all of baseball in both in both strikeouts and wins, 24-5. He won 24 of his 34 starts that year. And he also led the American League in ERA. So he won the pitching Triple Crown, was named Cy Young and MVP, which is rare for a pitcher to do ever. 2 of his 3 Cy Young awards have actually been with the Astros. So it's not as though his whole, sort of like you alluded to, he's had some years that added to his legacy that were with the Astros rather than the Tigers, and also both of his championships will now have been with the Astros. God, I'm sorry.
The best stretch of his career was with the Astros.
It absolutely was. Yeah. Especially if you take out the years he was just injured and missed pretty much whole seasons, it was very, very much with the Astros. So we're comfortable with Newhouser. And we were basically the same everywhere else. I was comfortable with moving Cabrera to third base because it does get a little bit light there. Another Hall of Famer named George Kell, but he played for 5 different teams. About half his career was with the Tigers. I believe George Kell actually also spent some time in Pittsburgh, so he was not a lifelong Tiger. So I was comfortable going with Cabrera, who's hit 318 this is actually even a couple years old. So he's probably, let me pull up his Tigers stats real quick, just to talk a little bit about Miguel Cabrera, because Cabrera is interesting. He's one of those guys. It's like, he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's still playing. And it's just like, nobody ever talks about the guy.
And while you're pulling that up, I'll just mention, I mentioned at the top of the last episode that, I checked a few different sources for this. Baseball Reference, obviously, Baseball Egg did their version of a starting 9. And then I mentioned that there was a writer for Yahoo who did a similar thing with the starting teams. And he kind of equivocated where he said he was doing everybody. And he'd put Babe Ruth on the Yankees team. But when it came time, he would all of a sudden invoke, I'm trying not to put guys from the dead ball era, or I'm trying not to put guys from the pre-integration era in. And as I get to this Tigers one, I'm like, oh, here we go. Because this will be an episode one time, but while Ty Cobb could by no means be considered a progressive guy for this era or any era he lived in, this idea that somehow Ty Cobb was singularly the most racist man who ever lived is just not consistent with any primary source reality. So I was waiting to read this guy say, well, I'm not putting Ty Cobb in because he was a horrible human being, and then quoting a fictional scenario in Field of Dreams, which a lot of guys do. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, he just said Ty Cobb next. Like, Ty Cobb next. I was like, oh, all right. Well, he's right about that. So again, kind of an aside while I vamped while you put up the stats. But do you have what you were looking for now?
Yeah, just on Cabrera real quick. I just wanted to say what he said, or say what he did in his time with the Tigers. He's in his 16th year with the Tigers. I don't know if he's announced his retirement, but I think it's sort of understood.
He has
announced it. Okay. He's 40 years of age. 370 home runs, 1338, batting average 305. He only played 53 games this season. The guy's not playing. He's not playing every day. And I'm pretty sure they stink this year, right? Aren't they pretty? Yeah, they're 42.
Tigers, they're
42
not as
and
horrible
52.
They've been horrible for a while, but they're not as horrible as they could be this year.
And Cabrera, back-to-back MVPs, 13 and 14, including a Triple Crown season in what year did he win the Triple Crown? His first of 2 MVP years in 2012, their World Series year. He was the Triple Crown winner with 40. So they had a pitching Triple Crown winner. They had 3 seasons where the Tigers got the MVP with Verlander and then Cabrera, and back-to-back seasons. First year with a pitching Triple Crown, and the second year with a batting Triple Crown, which hadn't happened. I believe there hadn't been a batting Triple Crown since Yastrzemski in '67. So I couldn't, given the alternatives, I couldn't leave either Cabrera or Greenberg off. I feel like I needed them both on there. So that just leaves us with, and I actually had Harry Heilman and I crossed him out and put Sam Crawford. It is really, really close. Both played 15 years with the team. Heilman WAR of 67.6, Crawford 63.5. I might have to give this to you. I'm not going to look at home runs because Crawford played in the dead ball era. Go ahead.
Although, to be fair, Heilman started in the dead ball era and, started out hitting 2, 5, 5, 8 home runs. And then, while not a power hitter, jumped up to 19, 21, 18. So was able to transition to a different era. In 1921, he had 139 RBIs in 1921.
The other thing I want to look at with these two guys, and I know this isn't, Crawford was on the teams that made it to the World Series 3 years in a row with Cobb in the late 1900s. Heilman played from 16 to 29, so he was on some okay Tigers teams, but nobody who made the World Series or anything like that. What I want to look at here is the sort of, Heilman won 4 batting titles. He hit 400 in 23. He hit 403. He hit 394. He had a stretch of 394, 356, 403, 346, 393, 367, 398 in 1927, and actually in his last year with Detroit hit 344 in 1929 at 34 years old. Yeah, Crawford led the league in RBIs 4 times, and actually led the league in home runs with 16 in 1901. Well, but that wasn't even with Detroit. That was with the Cincinnati Reds. It's Heilman. My first instinct was correct. I'd crossed out Heilman and put Crawford, and I shouldn't have done that. So we were basically in agreement with one thing that Andrew had to kind of bring me back to reality on. So that's, and incidentally, we won't get into it too much, but Bill Freehan had a really interesting career. Great defensive catcher for the Detroit Tigers, played for a very long time, passed away, I believe, in 2020. I remember we covered him on an in memoriam one of those years. So our starting lineup for the Tigers: Bill Freehan, Hank Greenberg, Charlie Gehringer, Miguel Cabrera, Alan Trammell, Ty Cobb, Al Kaline, Harry Heilman, and Hal Newhouser.
Kind of interesting that they did overlap for about 2 years in 1916 and 1917. So just kind of interesting that as Crawford's career was ending, Heilman's was beginning. So a little bit of an overlap.
There's a guy who wrote a book about Crawford and Heilman, and there might have even been a third guy, or it might have just been those two, basically about the great Detroit Tiger outfielders of the early 20th century who played in the shadow of Ty Cobb. It might have actually been called In Ty Cobb's Shadow or something like that. So I don't know. I got to say that's a pretty good, to use a golf analogy, that's a good score for the first guy to head into the clubhouse. That's a solid performance for these next 4 teams to try and have to match with.
Yeah, you're right. That's going to be one where they sit. It's not like we'll get to a 4th or 5th team and be like, oh, they blow everybody out of the water. They're going to set the pace. I mean, there's a few right off the top that I look and go, okay, they're not going to catch them, but I'm not going to rule out that somebody might catch them. Was my turn now?
Indeed.
Let's go with the White Sox. And here's what I have. Catcher, Sherm Lawler. First base, Frank Thomas. Second base, Eddie Collins. Shortstop, Luke Appling. Third base, Robin Ventura. Then the outfielders, Minnie Minoso, Harold Baines, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and Ed Walsh.
8 for 9. This is a good mix.
Do you not have Jackson? Because any player who sits in concert.
No,
if you had gone first, I was going to say that, but
no, you had me. I mean, there's Eddie Collins, one of the great players of the dead ball era, great second baseman. Luke Appling, not really known for his power, but a really good offensive and defensive shortstop for the White Sox in the 20s and 30s, or more like 30s and 40s, I should say. 30 to 50, I believe, was his career. Robin Ventura is a little bit of the weak link, but he had some solid years with the White Sox. Frank Thomas, obviously his best years. I believe Thomas won back-to-back MVPs in the 90s, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Right.
I had Jackson, I had Baines, I had Minnie Minoso, who he's since passed away, but we just saw him last year inducted into the Hall of Fame when my wife Allison and I and Andrew went up and saw the Hall of Fame induction last year. You got to go with Big Ed Walsh as the pitcher, known among other things for having a really good spitball. My one difference, I went Carlton Fisk instead of Lawler, and that was close.
That's one that was a debate. Yeah. So by the way, Thomas won the MVP in 93 and the strike short in 94 season. So he was the MVP both of those years, and then finished in the top. He finished third in 90. So between 91 and 97, he finished first, third, or eighth in the MVP every one of those years, and then finished second. That's actually pretty crazy. He finished second in the MVP in 2000. Like that much later, when he was in his, he was 32 when he finished second in the MVP in 2000. And Jesus, I know this won't count, but he finished fourth in the MVP in 2006 when he was with Oakland at 38 years old.
No, I didn't. That must have been a heck of a year for him.
So he, in 2000,
39 home runs. Yeah.
He won a ring with the White Sox that year, but he wasn't a huge part of that team, but he did win a ring. He went to.
Not only was he not a big part of the team, he was hurt for he didn't play in the postseason in that. His I'm trying. Let me see if I can pull up his game logs. My Baseball Reference is moving kind of slow for me tonight for some reason. Oh, there we go. He didn't play in a game that year after July 20th. And I think he actually threw the first pitch out in the World Series or something. So I think it was widely even understood during that season that his White Sox career was over. Although, like you said, and he went to Oakland and had a hell of a year, at least 1 year in 2006. He was weird. He went from Oakland to Toronto and then back to Oakland in those last 3 years of his career. So, so he's great. So I guess the one thing we want to talk about is this Carlton Fisk, Sherm Lawler thing. Sherm Lawler, who actually starts his career, and we've talked about him a little bit when we did our episode on the Go-Go White Sox, the 59 team, starts his career with the Yankees in 1947. Actually starts his career with Cleveland the year before, but then he's a Yankee for a couple years and actually plays in the World Series a couple games because Yogi Berra is being tortured on the base paths by Jackie Robinson, among others. So they actually start Lawler in a couple games in that 47 World Series. And then once it becomes clear that Yogi is going to be the catcher of the future, Lawler goes to the Browns and then has his best years with the White Sox, wins 3 Gold Glove awards. He's an all-star. Well, he's an all-star in 7 different seasons. There's a couple of those years are those double all-star years. So I think Baseball Reference that lists him, I think, is a 10-time all-star, 9-time all-star. But he makes it in seven distinct seasons. Now he only
6 out of 7 years with the White Sox. Between 54 and 60, he's an all-star. The only year he's not in there is 58. Or excuse me, 57. He's not an all-star.
He wins the first 3 Gold Gloves at catcher. They do just Major League Gold Gloves for the first year, and then after that they move to to both leagues, and he wins the first three, 57, 58, and 59. So you can argue that he probably would have won a few, although Berra might have won a few in the 50s also. But he won the first 3 Gold Gloves at catcher that were there to win. I'm guessing, and it's funny too, the other guy that neither one of us mentioned was Ray Schalk, who was the catcher on the Black Sox. He was one of the guys who was clean, but nonetheless, he was one of the Black Sox in the Hall of Fame. He was with the White Sox for a full-on 17 years. So let me take a look at this. 13 years for Fisk, 12 years for Sherm Lawler. WAR is very close, 28 versus 26. More home runs for Fisk, 214 to 124. Lawler's got a slightly higher batting average, 265 versus 257. I know that Fisk's sort of most memorable years were with the Red Sox. I think I still sort of feel inclined to push for him. I don't know. What are your thoughts? And Fisk, by the way, Fisk's only Gold Glove in his whole career is 1972 as a rookie with the Red Sox. So Lawler better defensively.
I think as a kid, I thought Fisk was only on the White Sox at the very end of his career. And really, he's on the White Sox starting in the early 80s, isn't he? He's there from
he is 81. There from 81 all the way until he retires in the middle of the 93 season. So all are part of 13 seasons.
So he's there for quite a while. So, I'm fine with that. I did think when I looked, it was close. So I am willing to go with Fisk. As I look at this team, this is a pretty good team. Joe, I looked extra hard at Joe Jackson because I was concerned that this is an interesting, and actually I looked really hard at Joe Jackson twice because when we do Cleveland, people had him in the all-time teams for Cleveland too. I want to ask you a question on this. And so it's actually funny because it's been in the news lately again with the Titanic, where it's like, if the Titanic never sank, would people today have heard of it? And I think the answer is no. If Joe Jackson, if the 1919 White Sox thing never happens, but Joe Jackson, he has another few, where would Joe Jackson's career be regarded? Because sometimes I can't tell, is he underrated? Is he overrated because of what happened? And then obviously all the different media that's come out of it after that. Was he a generational player really, or was he just a pretty good player or a great player, but not, you know what I mean?
I do. So I guess there's sort of 2 questions there, and not to be too philosophical.
Really asking 2 questions here.
So the first question is, would he be remembered in sort of the popular conscious? And I think no. I think that he wouldn't be Cobb. Now, part of the reason why Cobb gets remembered is because of the off the field stuff, which, as you mentioned, even some of that is not entirely accurate, but nonetheless, he wouldn't be known in the pantheon, even if you put aside the off the field stuff. He wouldn't be in the same pantheon as a Cobb, where when they named the 50 greatest athletes, not baseball, the 50 greatest athletes of the 20th century, Ty Cobb was like number 20. He was up there with Jim Brown and Michael Jordan and, Gretzky and, Babe Didrikson and Zaharias. He wouldn't be on that level. I think among baseball people, he would still be remembered because first of all, I think is he second or third all time in batting average with 356. Now, the chances are he's fourth all time with a 356 average. Now, the interesting thing about that is, and I guess he was third for a lot of years. And then with the inclusion of Negro League statistics, Oscar Charleston has moved into second. So he's third or fourth, depending on how you want to look at it. But he's well up there. So there's that piece of it. Now, obviously, batting average, unlike the under statistics, is something that can go down as time goes on, not up. So, But this is a guy starting with his first full years in the majors, 408, 395, 373, 338, 308 in 1915 when he was split between two teams, but then back up to 341, 301, 354, 351. And then also, guy has a hell of a year in 1920 before he gets kicked out of the game for life. Bats 382 at 32 years of age, 20 triples, 12 homers, 121 RBIs. I'd be curious to see. I'm guessing that first in the league in RBIs in 1920, first in the American League, almost had to be Babe Ruth. But let me see if I can pull up
with the Yankees. Yeah,
that 1920 season. So he was fourth in the American League in RBIs that year. And let me try and see if I can. Okay, so it was Ruth, and then a tie, two guys on the St. Louis Browns, George Sisler and a guy by the name of Baby Doll Jacobson, who was another outfielder for the Browns. And then one behind those two guys was Jackson with 121. And when you consider the fact that Jackson was suspended for the last 3 games of the season, when the scandal finally broke, he probably would have gotten an RBI at some point. So he would have been at worst tied for second. I think he would be like a Speaker, or
I was just about to say, would you consider him on the level of Tris Speaker?
Yeah.
Where people who know what they're talking about historically say, yes, he's one of the best players ever, but he's not somebody that even a diehard sports fan, but not a sports history fan, knows about.
I think that's exactly what he would be. I think he would be a Tris Speaker. He would be a Honus Wagner might be a little more popular, but like,
he's not Honus Wagner.
He'd be I'm talking about more like just like remembrances. I think he'd be like a Speaker or a, Rogers Hornsby. Again, Hornsby might be the best second baseman of all time, but he'd be on that level as far as how he was remembered in the popular conscience. So,
and truthfully, again, rightly or wrongly, popular conscience wise, even without the scandal, the nickname might bump him a little bit because he still had that nickname.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I think there's probably a reason why it's the Cy Young Award and not the Christy Mathewson Award or the Walter Johnson Award. So, yeah, I think nicknames do play a role. All right. So
sorry, that was a little bit of a diversion, but I just figured it was, the most likely time we were ever going to get to go over it. So,
yeah, I think you're right. All right. So it's my turn. We're on our third of 5, and maybe we just want to rip the Band-Aid off here and go with the Kansas City Royals.
Sure, let's do that.
So I went catcher Salvador Perez, first baseman Mike Sweeney, player on the team in the 90s, second baseman Frank White. I went George Brett at third base, the one sort of superstar on this team. Shortstop Freddie Patek, a teammate of Brett's in the 70s and 80s. And then for the outfield, I went Amos Otis, Willie Wilson, and Alex Gordon. And the pitcher was Brett Saberhagen. And this was sort of this is a weak team. This is a pretty weak team.
It's a weak team, but the thing I want to point out, again, this is a franchise that's been around, 50, 60 years, whatever it is at this point, I guess 60 at this point, or closer to that. They've had a couple of really good eras. Obviously, the team in the 70s was a really, really good team that had some, the majority of this team comes from that era. Maybe there was always the sense how maybe they should have won a little bit. They should have been a little bit better because the Yankees kept beating them in the ALCS, and then they got to the World Series in 80 and lost. Ultimately, they won in 85, but that was a slightly different team. And then, to be honest, they're an example of a team I use as like, I don't know, maybe this sounds weird, but like, it was really cool that they had that 2 years where they were a good team and they got to a World Series and they lost to the Giants in 14. And it was like, well, that was their chance. And then they went back the next year and won it. And I don't know. I maybe it was because I was there in May of 14 when people were like, oh, this team might actually be decent. And then they won the pennant that year and went to Game 7 of the World Series. As much as it's not a good franchise, I mean, they've had some moments. We agree on 8 of the 9. Saberhagen, the pitching, there's a bunch of guys you could consider, but I ultimately went with Saberhagen. You look at his numbers and...
Yeah, I mean, I think Saberhagen's pretty far and away. I mean, the guy won 2 Cy Youngs for them and was also won the World Series with them in 85. I think he's far and away the guy, frankly.
Okay. The outfield is pretty much just the 70s outfield, right? Wilson and McRae and Amos Otis.
No, I had Alex Gordon. I didn't have Hal McRae.
Oh, you didn't have Hal McRae?
No, I had Alex Gordon.
All right. So we agreed on 7 of the 9. So, and who did you have at shortstop?
Freddie Patek.
Okay. So I had Hal McRae as my third outfielder, and I had Alcides Escobar as my shortstop. Of the modern era guys, Perez is a no-brainer. I saw some people try to knock Mike Sweeney because he was on those really bad Royals teams, but I don't know. I don't feel like you would knock a guy for being on really bad teams from the 100 years ago. So it's not really fair to knock a guy for being on bad teams in the modern era. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 5-time All-Star. I don't think there's another 5-time All-Star that you'd be replacing him with.
Was you're gonna knock Ted Williams for not being on a lot, for not being on really, really good Red Sox teams. I know it's not a fair comparison, but so I guess we should compare the shortstops and the outfielders and the third outfielder and come to a consensus there, right?
Yeah. So here's what I looked at. And again, WAR is not disqualifying. I get that. But Freddie Patek, he was an all-star 3 times. Escobar has only been an all-star once. Escobar in 8 years with the team had a 9.2 WAR. Let me just verify that on Baseball Reference to make sure that the book I'm looking at includes that last. Okay, sorry. So 8 years, a 10.1 WAR, according to this. Patek is basically double that. It's 9 years and a 20.4 WAR. So basically double the WAR in the same amount of time. Patek also stole 3 consecutive years. He stole bases 49, 51, 53. So a good base runner. I don't think that Alcides Escobar really comes anywhere near that. Now his high is 31. So not terrible, but his high is 31. Patek, did I say whether he won a Gold Glove or not? I don't think he. Let me check Patek if he ever won a Gold Glove. I don't think he did. Escobar's got one. Patek never had one. So you want to maybe give the slight edge there to Escobar. But yeah, I'm pretty confident that Freddie Patek should probably be the guy.
All right, and I'll give you that one. Not even give you that one. You're correct on that one. And then outfield, I have McRae's numbers up.
We're basically going to do the opposite here now, where you're going to argue for the guy from the 80s, and I'm going to argue for the more modern guy. I had Alex Gordon.
Okay.
So let me pull up Gordon here. Entire career with the Royals from 2007 to 2020, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Gold Gloves. Never an All-Star. I'm guessing that Hal McRae just blows his offensive numbers out of the water. Give me McRae's offensive totals with the Royals.
All right. So 15 years with the Royals, 4 years with Cincinnati. I'm just trying to get this correct. So his batting average in 15 with the Royals was 293. He had 169 RBI or 169 home runs, 1,012 RBIs. On base percentage 356, slugging percentage 458. Let me get the WAR number here. If you just give me 1 second, WAR would be 27, or see, that's the total 27.6 in 15 years.
Let me see. Let me pull up Gordon's WAR. Gordon is 10.1. I'm sorry, no, he's 8.1 in 8 years. All right, yeah, you got me. It's Hal McRae. Maybe I just subconsciously wanted to get another guy because the only guy we have from that team now, since I took it from you on Escobar, we have basically 7 guys from the George Brett era, which lasted a long time, to be fair. We have 1 guy from the 90s, and then we got Salvador Perez from that championship team. So, yeah.
Steve Hagen, the George Brett era, really, is he?
Yeah, Brett was on those teams in the 80s.
Yeah, all right. I mean, the George Brett era, I guess when I'm thinking of like the 70s teams as that era,
Yeah, Saberhaven, right. I think, got there in like 84, 83, 84. But yeah, so yeah, so I think we, and I'm glad we do have Perez there, because he was a very, very good player for them for a long time. He was the MVP of the World Series that they won in 2015. And I shouldn't even refer to this guy in the past tense. He's still on the team. So, in fact, he was an all-star this year. So sorry to Salvador Perez, but yeah, I mean, hey, Salvador Perez, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8-time all-star, World Series MVP, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gold gloves. Is he a Hall of Famer? Probably not, but that's a heck of a career, especially with the Kansas City Royals. So our Royals lineup: Salvador Perez, Mike Sweeney, Frank White, George Brett, Freddie Patek, Amos Otis, Willie Wilson, Hal McRae, and Brett Saberhagen. And we've got 2 to go.
So we get the Senators, Twins, and the Indians/Guardians. I guess I'll go with the Senators/Twins. So I went with catcher Joe Mauer, first baseman Harmon Killebrew, second baseman Rod Carew, shortstop George McBride, third baseman Gary Gaetti, and then in my outfield I have Kirby Puckett, Tony Oliva, Sam Rice, and then my pitcher is Walter Johnson.
Okay, so you're pretty evenly split between Twins and Senators. Who was your
probably more Twins, but
who was your shortstop?
George McBride.
Okay. All right. Let's talk first. And George McBride was a senator, right?
Yeah, he was a very early senator.
All right. So let's start with shortstop.
Real quick, he was on the Senators from 1908 to 1920.
Okay. So shortstop for the Senators/Twins, I went with Joe Cronin, who played with the team for only 7 years, but he was the player before he moved on. He played the end of his career with the Red Sox. He was the player manager on their final World Series team in 1933. They made the World Series. They lost. He was the World Series didn't start, or the All-Star game didn't start for 33, but he was the AL shortstop in the first 3 All-Star games, 33, 34, and 35. Only played 7 years with Washington, but is in the Hall of Fame. Let me pull up McBride here, because I think
I'm wrong on this, to be honest. I think I'm going to jump ship here.
I kind of thought so. Yeah, McBride, 13 years, 22.8 WAR, 221 batting average, steals a bunch of bases, 116 bases, which is, well, I mean, that's less than 10 a year. I don't know. His home runs are really impressive during his time with the Senators. He manages 5 home runs in his 13 years as a Washington Senator. So it sounds like you are willing to go with Cronin on that one.
Yeah, I'm assuming I saw that somewhere and decided it was a good idea. I really, as you're saying it, I'm like, yes, that's Cronin is the correct answer here.
So I had Mauer, I had Carew, I had Walter Johnson. That's obviously a no-brainer. For my money, Walter Johnson's the best pitcher of all time. Give me your outfielders again, because I want to tell you what I did with the infield, and I think I'll probably win. And who was your third baseman?
Gary Gaetti.
Okay, well, let me tell you what I did in the infield, but we'll do that last. Let's go outfield first.
My outfield was Puckett, Oliva, and Sam Rice.
Okay, so I had Puckett, greatest twin of all time. I had Tony Oliva, who was a star for the Twins of the early 60s, early to mid 60s, those World Series teams. A guy we just saw, another guy we saw inducted, and he's still alive. So we saw him and got to see him interviewed and everything last year at the Baseball Hall of Fame induction in the summer of 2022. So that was really cool. So we both were sort of thinking the same thing here. You went with, and the other guy I would mention that I at least think was worth mentioning, even though neither one of us had it, was Torrey Hunter, who won Gold Gloves in center field every year for a decade and was sort of a mainstay of those halfway decent Twins teams at the beginning of the century. So didn't consider him seriously, but I thought he was worth mentioning. Okay, so Sam Rice played 19 years with the Senators, all but his final years. He was a career .323 hitter, only hit 33 home runs in his entire career. In 19 seasons, he's got, and plus he steals 346 bases, so that's not so bad either. In 19 years, he's got a 52.7 WAR with the Senators.
Mhm.
I went with Goose Goslin, who played for some different teams. He actually was on the Senators in the 1920s when they won the World Series in 24 that was Walter Johnson finally got a championship. And then again in 25 when they lost the World Series to Pittsburgh. He disappeared. He was, I think, with the Browns for a couple of years and then came back to the Senators for only 1 year in 1933 and helped take them to the pennant, then immediately left for Detroit and played in 2 more World Series. He, in 12 years, has a 43.2 WAR. So his average WAR per year is better than Sam Rice. Average is 323, which let me go back and look at Rice here. I think that might be the same number. Yeah, they both hit 323 in their career with the franchise. Goslin's a bigger home run hitter. He's got 127, fewer steals. You know, this is so close. They both are like in the, well, Goslin's got like a one game of WAR per year higher. It looks like Rice's comes out to about 2.5 and Goslin comes out to about 3.5. Which years was Sam Rice on the team? 15 to 33. So he was there for all of the years too. He was there for the World Championship. He was there for the, I think it's really close. I guess maybe if we want to go with Sam Rice because he was on the team the whole time and didn't sort of scatter around. I'm willing to go with that with you.
All right. Yeah,
All right.
You're right. I think it is close, but
all right. So let's stick with the Senators here for a second, because you had Harmon Killebrew at first base.
yes.
I had Killebrew at third because he played a decent amount of third in his career. Let me look here and just make sure this isn't one where I'm really shoehorning it in. Well,
I'm pulling it up as well. Third base. You're right. You know what? That's enough. It's close, but I say that's enough.
Yeah, so 15. And you know what? Here's the thing, too, I would say about Killebrew. It looks to me like he kind of is able to go back and forth. So he plays basically all of 59 at third base. And then he's mostly first base in the outfield. But then they must have, brought in somebody. In 69, he plays more at third than he does at first. In 70, he's almost predominantly third base. So it's not like, okay, he played it a little bit at the beginning of his career. Plus he played outfield, first base, and third. So it's almost like since he played all three, I'm comfortable slotting him in at any of the three because he was a guy who his whole career could move around. And the fact that he did it both early and late in his career makes me think that it wasn't just something that he did for a couple seasons at the beginning of the end. It worked for him.
I think that's fair. I'm fine moving him to third.
Okay, so then that bumps Gary Gaetti, and we need a first baseman. And I went with a guy who's got a name that you might recognize, but probably not the same guy. I went with a guy from the Washington Senators of the 1920s and early 30s by the name of Joe Judge, who was the starting first baseman on the Washington Senators in the 1920s, was the starting first baseman on the team that made it to the World Series and won it in 24 and then made it back and lost the following year. So I went with him. Let me just pull him up real quick. 18 years with the franchise, 47 WAR, not a power hitter, only 71 home runs, but an average of 299. So I'm comfortable with him getting the nod. He didn't really play. His last year was 33 or 34. So he didn't play in the All-Star era, but my guess is he would have been one several times. So I'm comfortable with bumping Gary Gaetti, sliding Killebrew in at third, and making Joe Judge the first baseman.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, especially if we're able to move Killebrew, then yeah, that's probably the best way to go.
All right, so Joe Mauer, Joe Judge, Rod Carew, Harmon Killebrew, Joe Cronin, Goose Goslin. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We went with Sam Rice, not Goose Goslin. Sam Rice, Tony Aliba, Kirby Puckett, and Walter Johnson. 3 Joes, about half Twins, half Senators. So a solid team, and that brings us only down to 1.
Yes, that is the Cleveland Indians / Guardians, and I guess Naps in there for a while.
Correct. And it's my turn. And here's where I went. Catcher, I went with Sandy Alomar Jr. First baseman, Jim Thome. Second baseman, Napoleon Lajoie. Third base, I went with Al Rosen, 50s, later GM of the Yankees. Shortstop, Lou Boudreau. Outfield, I probably went a little more modern than you might think. I went with Tris Speaker. And then I went with Kenny Lofton, and I went with Albert Bell. And then my pitcher was Bob Feller.
All right. So I went with the 2 older outfielders and a more recent third baseman than you. The rest of them we're in agreement on. So we're in agreement on 6 out of the 9. Third base, I went with Jose Ramirez over Al Rosen. Jose Ramirez, who's still currently on Cleveland, and I'm pulling up his numbers now just so we can compare. He's been on the team since 2013, so he's been in the league 11 years. Although 2013 he was only there 15 games. He has already been an All-Star 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That does not include 2020. Well, he wouldn't have been an All-Star in 2020 because there was no All-Star game, but he finished second in the MVP voting in 2020. Already his WAR is, let's see what his WAR is. His WAR is already 43.8 in 11 seasons, not 11 complete seasons yet because he's still playing this year. You know, again, if 2020 had an All-Star game, he'd be an All-Star 6 of the last 7 years. Batting average 279, home runs 206, RBI 720, on base percentage 355.
Yeah, I think you sold me. I think this was one of those where maybe I was looking at, older things and didn't realize that maybe it was written when Ramirez was, 4 years ago. So Ramirez's career hadn't rounded out yet. Plus the guy's only 30 years of age, so he might do more with Cleveland before his career is up. Al Rosen plays his entire 10-year career with the Indians, although 2 of those years are 7 and 5, and then actually even the year after that is 23. So he doesn't reach his rookie limits until 1950 at 26 years of age. He's got a WAR of 32.3 with the Indians, but 10.1 of that come from this astronomical 1953 MVP season that he has, where he looks like damn near wins the Triple Crown because he's home runs 43, RBIs 145, highest in all of baseball, and then his batting average is 336. And just for the fun of it, let me see where he was on the batting average list. So he was 53. Okay, he was second in the AL in batting average in 1953, behind Mickey Vernon with the Washington Senators, who's actually a guy considered for the last team. I would imagine, he almost wins the Triple Crown, which would probably make him even more impressive. Hard to do more than win the MVP, but nonetheless. So that is sort of a long, drawn-out way of saying that I am with you on Jose Ramirez. I do think that maybe I overblew Rosen based on basically one monster year. So, all right. So it sounds to me, you said our infield and catcher are all the same, right? Alomar, Thome, Lajoie, Ramirez, and Boudreau.
If we agree on Ramirez, then yes.
Yeah, we do.
Feller is obviously pitcher, and we agree on Speaker. The other 2, and I'm willing to be probably talked out of at least one of these, but I did have Larry Doby and then Earl, and I'll admit my ignorance here. Is it Averill or Averill?
I've heard it both ways.
Okay. I had the two of them as my two outfielders, which is I'm not going to argue too hard against Kenny Lofton because I love Kenny Lofton. He's one of my favorite players who, I mean, technically he was a Yankee, but he was one of my favorite players who never played for my team. Averill was on the team for 10 years or 11 years, 29 to 39. He was an all-star every year starting in 33 when the all-star game started. He was a WAR with Cleveland. His WAR was, where are we? Show advanced batting. His WAR hang on. Sorry, I thought I had it. WAR of 51.3 with Cleveland from 29 to 39. Batting average with Cleveland was 322. 121 home run, or excuse me, 226 home runs and 1,084 RBIs. High watermark for home runs would have been 32 in 1931 and 1932. Early 30s was really his best time. Ended up 143 RBIs in 1931. Really had a pretty prolonged period, 7, 8, 9 years where he was a very, very productive offensive player.
All right. So I think actually we can knock Albert Bell off right away. I was really impressed by his power numbers. And, maybe just the fact.
Was it long enough?
It was only 8 years. And I think a few of those years were before he bulked up some mysterious way and started really hitting home runs. 8 years. WAR was only 27.3. So that's less than 4 a year. He obviously 93 has a really good year. 95, he should have been MVP, but because the writers all hated him. 95 in a shortened season. What was that? 144 game season. I think that was. Guy hits 50 home runs with 126 RBIs. My guess is, so let me just look that up. That WAR of his is in the high 20s. And I'd be willing to bet that's sort of like I was just talking about for Al Rosen. I'd be willing to bet that a pretty big chunk of that WAR in his Cleveland years is from that one season yet. Well, 7.0 and then a couple in the 5.7. Yeah. So his years, like you said, he barely he comes up in 89, but then he barely plays. He only plays 9 games in 90. And then after that, he gets decent. So yeah, leads the league in RBIs 3 times, leads it in homers once. Decent batting averages he's putting up too, 357 in 1994. So nothing to sneeze at, but you're right, maybe just not long enough. So I'm comfortable with knocking him off. So now we're between Kenny Lofton, Larry Doby, and Earl Averill. All 3 predominantly center fielders. And this book that I have, the Tom Stone book, let me show you what it's got here. 10 years for Lofton with a WAR of 48.5. 11 years for Averill with a WAR of 47.9. 10 years for Doby with a WAR of 43.4. So that's basically 4.8 a year for Lofton, about 4.3-ish a year for Averill, and about 4.3 for Doby. So they're really close. Averill's got the best batting average with 322. He's got the best home runs with 226. In fact, he's got more home runs than Bell. Oh no, he's got close with Bell. Bell had 242. So I think I got to give in to you on Earl Averill because he's got the highest average. He's got just almost as many home runs as Bell. His WAR is right there. So now it's between Kenny Lofton and Larry Doby. Now, Larry Doby obviously is an inspiring story, integrates the American League. I'm inclined to give this to Lofton. He's only got about 40% of the home runs that Larry Doby has.
That wasn't his game, though.
But the WAR is better. The average is 14 points higher. And he's got 10 times as many stolen bases. He's got 452 stolen bases. So as much as it seems strange to knock off a Hall of Famer for a non-Hall of Famer, incidentally, I think Kenny Lofton belongs in the Hall of Fame, but that's a conversation for a different time. I feel like I got to push a little bit for Kenny Lofton here.
Yeah, 4 Gold Gloves as well. I'm not going to put up any kind of a fight. I'm good with Lofton.
So our Cleveland Indians / Guardians / Naps. And we have to say Naps because they were called that because one of the guys who's on the team, Sandy Alomar Jr., Jim Thome, Napoleon Lajoie, Jose Ramirez, Lou Boudreau, Tris Speaker, who we'll probably talk more about Speaker when we get to Boston in a couple months, Kenny Lofton, Earl Averill, and Bob Feller. And that's another, in my opinion, really, really solid team. We've been doing this for a few hours now, and we're probably getting to the end of our energy level here, but why don't we real quick, we got to rank these Kansas City's 5. We're easy to, I think we can say that.
Kansas City's 5. We'd have to look. They might be the best 5, but so far they're 5. I don't know how we want to go about splitting these because these are all, when you factor in that the Twins carry the Senators, these are all original American League teams, going all the way back to the 1900s. Now, the Senators weren't a tremendously good team, but they had some really good players, and then the Twins had some really good players. I guess who would be, if we think about 4 and 3, I guess the way you look at it is who is definitely not one of those 4.
So real quick,
mm-hmm.
The White Sox, Tigers, and Twins all have 8 Hall of Famers. Cleveland has 6. And that one of those 3 that's not a Hall of Famer is Lofton. I think Cleveland probably falls to 4. I do think they do. It's close. Bob Feller was one of the greatest pitchers of all time, would have been higher on the all-time list if it hadn't been for, I think he missed 4 full seasons during World War II. Speaker, one of the greatest outfielders of all time, but he does a lot of that in Boston. Alomar, great defensive catcher, but he's not going to the Hall of Fame, or he's not going to the Hall of Fame. We talked about Lofton. Lou Boudreau is one of those weaker Hall of Fame types, and Jose Ramirez, based on what he's put forward, he's a very good player, but he's probably not going to the Hall of Fame. So I think I'm comfortable with Cleveland at 4.
Okay.
All right.
That leaves the White Sox, the Senators, and the Twins. And I'm looking up and down, and
also,
go ahead.
Well, here's a question. Do you think Joe Mauer goes to the Hall of Fame one day? I mean, he already had his chance probably and didn't get voted in, I would think. When did he retire?
I'm going to look that up. Hang on.
He won an MVP and batting titles. 3 batting titles as a catcher.
Retired in 2018. So if he was on the ballot, he just went on the ballot.
Yeah, and sort of his monitor numbers have him probably coming up just short. I'm going to work backwards here for a second. I think Detroit is 1.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, the only place you would find a little weakness with Detroit comparatively is pitcher. Yeah. But, Greenberg, Gehringer, Cabrera, who most of his career was with Detroit, Cobb, who's an all-time great, Al Kaline, Harry Heilman. I think you're right that Detroit is probably 1.
And I think that because he played his whole career in Detroit and, was not a highlight guy, Al Kaline maybe doesn't get the accolades he might deserve. He's an 18-time All-Star now. Again, a couple of those are during the double All-Star season, so you have to discount that. But the guy played forever, first of all. He played 22 seasons, won a world title with the Tigers in 1968, 10 gold gloves, won a batting title, has got 399 career home runs. He's another guy who passed away in 2020 that we talked about in our in memoriam. Cabrera, like I said, is sort of quietly putting up a Hall of Fame career. Greenberg didn't have a ton of longevity, but was one of the great first basemen of all time, neck and neck with Lou Gehrig for a while in the 30s, 58 home runs in 1934. So I'm comfortable with Detroit at 1. The rest of this, and we ended up going Fisk for the White Sox, right?
We did, yeah.
We did, okay. This is close.
It's very, very close.
This is close. I'm looking here for weak links. And the one who sort of stands out immediately is Robin Ventura. Although is Joe Judge that much better?
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side of the coin,
pitching.
Walter Johnson's an all-time great. Not that none of these, most of these guys are all-time greats. So I'm talking about like the only two real Pantheon legends here in my book are Johnson and possibly Eddie Collins.
Jackson played a bunch of his career elsewhere. Joe Jackson.
So did Baines. Even Minnie Minoso, I think, did.
I'd go with Minnesota, too. Senators, Minnesota.
Okay. Minnesota, too. That is not what I would have thought would have been where we came out. We won't do it, or at least we won't do it anytime soon, but it'd be interesting to see how this was different if we were looking at full rosters versus just the starting 9's. But yeah, I mean, for the second episode in a row, a team that spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. surprised me with how solid their 9 was. So Detroit Tigers, Freehan, Greenberg, Gehringer, Cabrera, Trammell, Cobb, Kaline, Heilman, Newhouser join with the Atlanta Braves and the Oakland Athletics and the St. Louis Cardinals. And maybe just because we haven't gone long enough tonight, let me just give those lineups real quick. St. Louis is Molina, Pujols, Hornsby, Ken Boyer, Ozzie Smith, Musial, Slaughter, Brock, and Gibson. The A's, Cochran, Jimmy Fox, Eddie Collins, Home Run Baker, Bert Campaneris, Al Simmons, Ricky Henderson, Reggie Jackson, Lefty Grove. The Braves are Joe Torre, Freddie Freeman, Ozzie Albies, Eddie Matthews, Robert Moranville, Hank Aaron, Andrew Jones, Dale Murphy, Warren Spahn. And then the Tigers, who we just did, Freehan, Hank Greenberg, Charlie Gehringer, Alan Trammell, Miggy Cabrera, Ty Cobb, Al Kaline, Harry Heilman, and Hal Newshouser. And so we have 2 more divisions to do. I think our plan is to probably do those sometime in the fall, early fall, September-ish, so we can wrap this up by the time the baseball season is wrapping up. And I think, in a lot of ways, we saved the 2 most fun ones for last, because we got the AL East with the Yankees, Red Sox, and Orioles, 3 long-standing franchises. And then we've got the National League West with 3 newer franchises, but then the Dodgers and the Giants, which obviously are going to be a lot of fun.
Well, the way I look at it, the Rockies and the Diamondbacks will be kind of tough, although there's some history there. Tampa Bay is very interesting with the way they've done things. Toronto's got a little bit of history. The Padres, then you get the Orioles and the Browns, but the Browns weren't very good. But the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Dodgers, and the Giants. I will leave an open mind on the NL West, whether it's going to be the Dodgers or the Giants. Ultimately, my initial gut is that it'll be the Dodgers. But, as I think the Giants are going to have Willie Mays. They're going to have Christy Mathewson. And then in the American League, the Red Sox will be very, very good, but it's going to be the Yankees. And then, we'll see where we are in the top 6. But I would think that, if we're going to do it by league, if the competition's the A's and the Tigers, the Yankees will be beating them out. And then it'll be a question of the National League, whether it's the Cardinals, whether it's the Dodgers, whether it's the Giants, but this has been fun.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode and the last one. And frankly, for all of our episodes that we do, because we cover everything on Hello Old Sports, lists, stories, you name it. So until we catch up again for the next episode, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, Old Sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I wanted to thank you for stopping by to listen to another episode here on the Sports History Network. Our podcasters are passionate about uncovering and sharing sports stories from yesteryear. And if you didn't know it already, we have over 30 shows across the network covering all sorts of sports history topics. In fact, here's a glimpse into one of our awesome podcasts here on the network.
With every race, every qualifying run, and every pit stop, Tim Coffeen would feel the pressure and excitement. With his own podcast on the Sports History Network called Tim Coffeen Talks IndyCar and Racing History, Tim will share those very same racing emotions and memories with his listeners. Learn, laugh, and enjoy the world of IndyCar racing through the eyes of Tim Coffeen.
How about that? I bet you're super hyped to go listen to that new podcast, right? Well, to learn about this show and all the other podcasts on the network, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Head over there today to find your next favorite sports history podcast.